You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Coaching Inn. I'm Claire Pedrick, and today I'm in conversation with Raggi Kotak, who sent a lovely message to say it felt relieving to hear your recent discussion on race, mostly because you accepted how little you knew about working with those of us with other identities and how important it is to hold these conversations in the predominantly white world of coaching. Well, Raggi, thank you so much for being willing to come and have a provocative conversation with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for making contact. It really helps to broaden our own insights and experience to have really great conversations, doesn't it?
Thank you for having me. I forgot I sent you that message. I do remember now. I remember listening to one of your podcasts talking about race.
Yeah.
I'm feeling relieved that the conversation was happening. So yeah,
there are more to come.
Awesome.
We've got somebody is in Liz Price's Unlearning group.
Oh, right, yes.
She's going to come in and talk about what she's learning kind of live in the moment, which is really exciting.
That's brilliant. That's great.
So you have a very interesting background as a barrister, a coach, a human being, a provocateur.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about your professional journey and your human journey, Raggi.
So my professional journey as a coach, I'm a fairly new coach. I studied last year. I qualified at the end of last year, and I've been coaching since then. I'm probably about 60, 70 hours in and trying to get to my 100 so I can get accredited.
Fantastic.
And in relation to my other journey, my main career was as a barrister. I practiced for around 20 years, representing asylum seekers. And about 2 years ago, I stopped taking on work and I started working full-time as a race educator. So I'm working with individuals in organizations, talking about racism and other forms of oppression and how they can do better, how they can challenge those dynamics and create a more level playing field.
Wow.
Yeah.
So a huge breadth of experience.
Thank you.
And lots of teachers amongst the people you've worked with who've made you the person you are today.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Yes.
I was particularly struck by from your email that you're new to coaching. And I think that one of the things that I noticed is that people who are new to being a coach, but also new into the coaching training space,
right,
probably see things that those of us who've been around for a long time don't see.
I hope so.
So what do you see?
What do I see in the coaching world? I don't really know the coaching world that well. I don't really feel that I've had that much contact with the world. It is one of the things I do, but it's one of the things I do amongst many.
Yeah.
My lens is always on anti-oppression because that's kind of what I do. So it's quite challenging coming into the coaching world because from my experiences, it's a predominantly white world, a predominantly privileged world. And, as part of the training, you're one of the only racialized people in the room. And that is impactful. That is impactful because I feel like I want to be cautious about what I say because I don't want to criticize anybody, but I had quite a difficult time of my training. I had quite a challenging time of my training, and various things came up in the group, which were about race. And as the only racialized person that mostly there, you're the one that really gets most impacted by those dynamics. So my journey into coaching wasn't really positive.
Yeah.
I have had some very positive interactions with coaches who have been very supportive. and my journey now as a coach. I really do love coaching. I really enjoy it. But the clients I see are mostly racialized or come with other backgrounds, like somebody's trans or they're queer or they're off color, because they're the kind of people that seek me out, really, I think.
Yeah.
Because if people want coaching, they want coaching by somebody who reflects their identities and understands their identities.
Mm-hmm.
And on LinkedIn or professionally, I'm very clear that I'm a racism disruptor, or, you know, and if you look at my background, it's clear that I've been working around injustice for my entire career. So people seek somebody out who is going to understand their experience.
Yeah.
So that feels really great. And I guess I should say, mostly now I'm charging more, but mostly for most of my coaching hours, I was coaching for charity donations to get the experience. And therefore, it was an accessible way for people to get access to a coach. And that's how these people found me as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hope you're going to still work with them.
Yes, I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's your experience of coaching people from diverse backgrounds? What skills and gifts do you notice that you need to draw on?
So I guess most people that come to me have a story about their own identity or their sense of belonging or a problem at work or something happening in their relationship or family. And what I notice is that structural issues of oppression, racism or homophobia or transphobia, is always a big part of the story. So they'll be telling me a story and they'll be saying, oh, you know, they tell me that I'm really angry all the time and you know, and I need to calm down. And I'll feel quite surprised because they don't come across as angry to me at all. And they'll be telling me a story of working with young people and the young people love them and then the other adults don't love them. And I'm sort of, well, why do they say you're angry? Isn't that something that happens all the time to Black women, that they're told that they're angry when they're just being articulate or expressing themselves? So what I find is within the stories, there's often elements of oppression that they're experiencing. And if you're not aware of how these systems work and you can't point them out, then they tend to internalize them and see it as something wrong with themselves. So I think it's really important to have an understanding of how systems of oppression work, not to assume that they're always there, but just to be aware of them and to ask the right questions so that you can ascertain what's really going on. I also think it's really important because I know from my own journey of being coached, and I am being coached at the moment. I'm in a peer reciprocal coaching sort of relationship through the ICF. I know that when I'm being coached with somebody who doesn't have this awareness, I don't bring my whole self. I'm not going to talk about the issues in my life that are impacting me. I'm not going to talk about these issues because they're not going to be understood on the other side. And I hear that from a lot of people. I hear that from people I coach that say how relieved they are. It's the first time they've ever been able to talk about these issues. So I don't think that you have to be coached by somebody who has the same identity as you at all. But I do think it's really important to be coached by somebody who understands identities. And I think that that's a core competent skill that we all need as coaches.
I agree. And what I think there's something there about being aware that there are things that may be a bit hidden at the beginning of the conversation, which may need just to be invited into the room if people want to say something.
Absolutely. It is so relieving. I notice how relieving it is for the people I'm working with when I show that I understand the dynamics. It's such a relief to have a space where you can actually speak from your heart and talk about what's really going on for you, instead of diluting what you're saying because there's a fear that it's not going to be held and understood. And also, as racialized people, we're not always used to talking about our experience because we haven't had the space. I think coaching is quite an elite space for people to have. Who really has access to coaching? If you don't have access, certain communities, more privileged people will have access to coaching. They can pay for it, or their organizations are paying for it. And I'm not suggesting that we don't have privilege as well, but I do find that there's less access to coaching in our communities.
Yeah. And if coaches become coaches because they want to earn money, then that's going to set them off in a direction of people who can pay. Absolutely.
I think it's a brilliant skill. I think coaching is really fantastic, and it's been really good for me. Doing my training has been really good for me because you're constantly being coached, and I've seen myself really grow through that experience. And I really love giving that experience to others, and I want those that don't have access to coaching to have access. It's important.
Yeah. And allowing people to feel heard for the whole of themselves.
Absolutely.
And not only feeling heard for the bit that people feel that they can listen to, and I don't want to listen to that, or I don't know to ask about that.
Absolutely.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about all the talking around systemic coaching and coaching people in their systems.
Okay.
And I'm just thinking that it's rare, or maybe very rare, when people are describing the whole systemic context to also talk about race and difference.
Okay. I don't know, because I haven't had that much experience around coaches that are doing systemic coaching. So I don't really know. When we talk about systemic coaching, what are we actually saying?
That's a really interesting question. And I think that's a really good direct question to ask people, isn't it? I think it's about people in the contexts in which they work. So it's in their organization, in their family system, in their everything, in the world.
Yes.
And you hear that a lot.
Right.
But you don't hear in your colour, in your experience of life,
But that makes no sense at all. Because how can you be coached in a system when you're not thinking about your racial identity or your sexuality or any of these identities that are so important to us? Surely that's a big part of the system.
Which is why we need to talk about it.
Yeah, because for me, my identity is a huge part of who I am. And I've been in spaces where I haven't felt comfortable with that identity a long time ago, because as a barrister, I worked in the political chambers where there was such a mix of people, and we were all really welcome as we are. But prior to that, I remember being in places where I felt really unwelcome. And you couldn't talk about these issues. You couldn't name race. You couldn't talk about our difference. Everybody had to be the same. Everybody had to show up the same. And that is really exhausting. Right? It's really important to have spaces where you can just be free and you can really talk about what's going on for you.
And it's allowing people to be uniquely themselves, whatever their story.
And I guess if you're not from one of those marginalized identities, you wouldn't really understand the importance of your identity. If I look at my friend circle, who are mostly people who are racialized or people who are queer, or I'm also queer, by the way, if you didn't get that bit. Who we are is such an important part of everything about us. And, it's not that we have to talk about it all the time because we're together, but it is really a big part of our lives. And I've also, I've been in therapy relationships for many years and realized afterwards how although I got a lot of healing, really, really brilliant healing, how difficult it was that they didn't understand my identities. And, various things come up where you can't get support around and which are not understood. And you have to swallow them, and you have to always kind of give space for the lack of understanding on the other side. And I think that's a problem. And I don't think it's that hard to educate ourselves about difference. I think we all have to go through a journey where we learn about different communities. Like, for example, I've had to do a lot of learning about trans communities or non-binary people, because, that's not my identity, but I do have people that I'm working with who have those identities, so I need to understand them. And it doesn't really take that long. I just have to do a little bit of reading, have some conversations, understand difference, to create a space where they feel welcome.
So you've said two really interesting things there. One is, this is what I do to understand.
Yeah.
I read a bit, I have conversations. What do you want, speaking as you personally, to feel understood? What do you see or hear or sense to feel understood?
I think I am racialized, but white people are also racialized. So what we do when we talk about race is we talk about people that look like me, brown people, black people, right? But I'm sort of cautious of what I'm saying, because all the racial identities, the whole thing is a social construct. It's something that was developed a few centuries ago in order to separate us, right? So there's no real science in the difference between us. We're all genetically the same. The only difference is really geography. My skin is darker because my family are from India, which is closer to the sun, so I need darker skin, right? So that's the only difference. But for centuries, we've been socialized in these differences. So in reality, we have to act as if these differences are real, because racism is real, right? So I talk, if being Asian, if being brown is a race, then being white is also a race. So what normally happens is white is seen as the norm, and every other race is seen as a default in opposition to white, right? But really, we're all in the circle together, and white is also a race. So for me, what I notice is white people get really, really anxious talking about race, because they're scared of the language, they're scared of saying the wrong thing, they don't want to cause offense, they feel that they don't know enough. What I think we all need to do is educate ourselves a little bit more, read some books, watch films, go on a training, create a space where you can learn a little bit more about your race, and then you feel more comfortable talking about race. You feel more comfortable with others talking about their race around you, right? So I just think there's so much fear around the subject of race. Yesterday I was in a school and working with 120 teachers. And, the first thing they talked about is being scared of saying the wrong thing. Everywhere I go, I ask people what their hopes are, what their fears are about this work. And everyone says the same thing. Everyone is scared of saying the wrong thing, scared of making mistakes, scared of hurting somebody. So, we all have to get over that and educate ourselves. Like we learn to be coaches. Yeah. We can learn to be racially literate.
And saying nothing is also saying the wrong thing.
Saying nothing. What happens is people say nothing because they're scared of saying the wrong thing. But if you're on the other side, right, you can tell they're so uncomfortable and they're saying nothing. And what it makes you think is that they're actually quite racist, right? So you say nothing so that you don't do the wrong thing, but actually it's more problematic. It makes you look more racist than anything else.
There was a beautiful story on Twitter the other day with a photograph of a woman holding a book. Right. And this guy was in a I think he was somewhere. He was working somewhere, and she came up to him and asked him a question. He's black, she's white. And he answered the question, and then she said, is your family origin? I think it was from Somalia, and he didn't know how to respond to that, but he kind of went with it, and he went, yes. And she said, I'm reading a really interesting book by somebody about Somalia. He's called, and then she said, I really, really want to meet him. He's called whatever his name is. And he went, that's me.
Yeah, I did see that. That was brilliant.
And then she said, here's the picture of me holding the book because I really wanted to meet the author. And isn't that a great example of that initial fear about how to have a conversation, but the opportunity to really kind of go through it?
Absolutely. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful story.
But we need to talk.
We need to talk. We need to be able to be comfortable talking about race, talking about difference, talking about our identities, being curious, right? The problem is, in that story, as you started telling it, I thought, oh no, where's this going to go?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that are seen as microaggressions, right, is when people are asked where they're from. So if I came up to you and we were in a meeting or something and I said, oh, where are you from? Right? Implicit within that is a kind of, you look different, you don't really belong. Right? But I'm really curious and I always want to know where people are from. Right? So how I do it is I'm really careful how I say these things because I want people to recognize that I'm trying to relate and trying to create connections rather than push somebody away and suggest that they don't belong. So I would say to you, oh, I'm so curious. Where's your accent from?
Yeah.
Or something like that. And you would answer. I'd be like, oh, I thought it was that. So I thought it might be this. And then we're having a conversation, right? Rather than just coming up to somebody who you don't know. And just the first thing you ask them is, where are you from? Right? In a really kind of dismissive way. So a lot of this is, people are worried about how to say things, right? I always think that curiosity and creating space for a relationship is always a good way to take a positive step forward.
And actually having some ways of opening up conversation with people matters in lots of aspects, doesn't it? So in the world of serious health issues and dying, it's much better to say, how's your day, than how are you? Because how are you is a completely overwhelming question.
That's a good thought. Yeah.
So having a few different ways of opening up conversation is just a really great thing to have in our kit bag as a human, I think.
And I think it's just important to remember that we're all humans.
Yeah.
And, to speak to somebody with a different identity is just speaking to somebody, right? So just kind of saying, hi, nice to meet you. Just anything, right? Just starting a conversation like you would with somebody with the same identity.
Yeah. Yeah. And make your ways in ways Absolutely. That are less triggering for others.
Absolutely.
Or overwhelming.
Absolutely. I do think that it is more than that for coaches. It's really important in the world. We all learn how to talk to different people, right? That's great. Yeah. But in the world of coaching, I think that people need a little bit more than just the courage to have a conversation. I think people need a level of racial literacy training where they understand. I do a lot of training with people where I'm talking about my identity, their identity, how we're all situated, how the systems of oppression work, how we're all socialized and conditioned within those systems, and how we interrupt that. So I imagine most people who are white presenting, listening to this podcast, get racist thoughts and pretend that they don't, right? And we all get this, right? The majority of us will get racist thoughts and pretend that we don't, right? And we get this thought and we're horrified and we shove it away and we don't tell anybody, and everybody goes around the world pretending they don't get them, but everybody does get them and nobody talks about it. And the problem with that is most of our behavior is unconscious.
Yeah.
Right? And those racist thoughts are going to leak all over the place. So if you look like me, you talk about how regularly you experience microaggressions. And those microaggressions are because people are not owning their socialization and conditioning. It doesn't mean people are bad. It just means that we've grown up in a society where whiteness has been centralized and depicted in positive ways, and people who are racialized are often depicted in negative ways. So Black men are on television programs as criminals. You know, there's a lot of rhetoric in the newspapers about them, and we all get these thoughts, right? Because we've had these messages again and again and again. And if you don't become aware of that and then start to listen to them a little more and then make a choice about how you're going to act, you're going to leak all over the place. And that's what happens. Most of us are constantly leaking all over the place, and we just don't take responsibility for that. And we're not making conscious choices to act in a more equitable way. And that's the problem.
And that's about the inside work, isn't it?
That's about the inside work. And people are terrified of that work, but then they'll do really deep work about other parts of their world. And, you know, as coaches, we've all done quite a lot of personal work and we hold a lot of personal work. But this part is almost ignored, and it's not so bad, right? There's so much fear because we have centuries and centuries of oppression around race, and there's a lot of energy around the words. So people are very fearful. But actually, it's really relieving. When I held this space with teachers yesterday, they were all rushing up to me saying, wow, that was so amazing. I had such great conversations with my colleagues. We don't talk with our colleagues about race. But when there's a facilitated space, I always find people are really relieved to have the opportunity.
Yeah.
So we have to create those facilitated spaces initially so that people can have those conversations, or people have to do their own work and just pick up a book and start learning about difference. They just widen their experience and widen their horizons. The way we stop becoming so biased is by widening our knowledge base and learning more about difference. That's what really supports us.
Yeah. And talking about it.
Talking about it.
Gets it out from the inside.
So do you think about your whiteness? Do you have conversations about your racial identity?
I do. And I think a lot about my privilege. Okay. And then it gets very uncomfortable.
Sure.
And then I put it away.
Sure.
And then I wait till I'm courageous enough to do a tiny little bit more. It's a very slow journey because it's hard.
And do you do that work yourself, or do you have support?
I have support coming and I'm not accessing it. And this is a very challenging conversation in a good way.
Yeah, but you didn't expect me to ask you these questions, did you? I thought you were questioning me. But
no, but you're right.
I find it really interesting because I think privilege gets a bad rap, right? I love my privilege. I'm delighted, right, that I have privilege, right? It's really helpful to me and I really enjoy it. But it's, you know, what do I do with my privilege? Right?
Yeah.
So that's really the question, right? It's not, do you have privilege or a bad person? You know, great. We all, you know, I do believe in a more equal world, but I don't want to knock anyone for their privilege. But I do ask them what they do with it. How do you create a space that your privilege is used to support those around you to create a more equal playing field?
And there's different kinds of privilege, aren't there? Because there's the privilege of the fact that my parents were middle class and therefore all those privileges, but then, and that's the easy one to talk about.
Sure.
The harder one to talk about is I get on the bus and nobody looks at me.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Nobody follows you in a shop. Nobody, you know, people listen to you when you speak.
Yeah, that's a privilege. What's really interesting, which is the one that I'm thinking about at the moment, is that now I'm almost 60, grey haired, I notice that when I walk down the street, there are places where you walk down the street where people are coming the other way and they don't notice you and they push past you which didn't happen when I was younger.
Wow. Does that really happen?
Yeah. You wait till you get white hair. Yeah, it does. So there's something about invisible. There's something about an age thing for women, which is talked about quite a lot by women who've gone past that line, where there's an invisibility feeling. But then when I move, I would think I was saying this on a podcast the other day, when I move in the world of coaching, people go, oh, hi, it's you.
Wow.
And then I get privilege again. So probably for the same thing, being older and
that's interesting,
white-haired.
That's interesting. I just think that these things are important to be aware of and to notice and to recognize and notice where you have privilege, where you lose privilege, and where those around you have and lose privilege.
Yeah.
Right. It's not to attack you, to get a button and beat people over the head because they're excessively privileged. It's just about noticing and becoming aware of the impact you have in the world and the impact of others around you.
And one of the things that I notice that makes me very uncomfortable, so sometimes I choose to notice it and sometimes I choose not to, is that in my life, I've lived in areas that are very diverse. And I've also lived in areas that are not diverse at all.
Right.
And I observe here where there might be only one or two people of colour somewhere.
Okay.
That I might do something and nobody looks, and they might do something and everybody looks, if you're in a queue or, all those things. But we need to notice it, don't we? Because we need to recognise, because another way of describing the privilege we're talking about is what are the things that I take for granted that I don't know I take for granted about simply operating as a human in the world.
Yeah, these are important conversations for us all to have. And it's important for us to talk about whiteness and what it means to be white and how we move around the world. One of the questions that came up yesterday in this session I was running was, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be in this conversation. But to be honest, I don't really know why I have to do this work around racism, because it's not really my issue. It doesn't really impact me, and it's not my issue, and I don't really want to do it. And first of all, I thanked her for the courage of saying that, because she wasn't the only one thinking that in the room. But then, I pointed out that, but for white people, I wouldn't have a problem with racism at all. I would be completely good, right? So when white people say it's not really my problem, it kind of is, because, but for white communities, in this country I'm talking about, in the UK, racialized people would not have a problem, right? And of course there's racism across communities. In my community, the South Asian community, there's horrific levels of anti-blackness. We're hugely racist against Black people, and it's really important that we talk about that as well, right? So it's not just white people, amongst different communities, there's different levels of racism.
I've been holding on to this and I'm going to say it. One of the things that frustrates me is how quickly whiteness throws people out.
Yeah.
So if I have a child with a person of colour, my child is now a person of colour. My child is now Black, not white. Well, why? How? That's a really pushing out culture, isn't it? That's I am offending myself by what I'm saying, but there's something there about pure white, and you have to be white to be white.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we're all mixture of, all those DNA testing things would make us find that, I'm probably not English. In my heritage, there will be other nations.
Sure. I just feel curious and interested in everyone's background and what they bring and who they are, right? But we live in a world where racism has such a strong history, right? And if we're talking about being in Britain British history is really quite shocking when we're talking about issues of racism, slavery, colonialism, right? So I agree with you. Why are we in these conversations? But we do need to be in these conversations because that is the reality of the world we live in, and that is our history. Not to necessarily remain in them forever and to feel separated, but I think there's a point where we all have to do some individual work and understand where we're situated racially. If you don't understand where you're situated racially, then you're not going to understand the other. And as coaches, it's our responsibility to understand difference and understand the other and understand the person in front of us. How can you really support the whole of somebody if a huge part of their identity isn't within your awareness? Or if it is, you're too terrified to even ask a question or say something or point out the systemic nature of what they're talking about, the systemic issues that are impacting them. Because you're like, am I going to say the wrong thing? Is this right? What am I going to do? It's time for us all to step up a little bit and educate ourselves. This conversation is not going to go away.
No.
Post George Floyd being killed, post the pandemic, everybody's talking about race, right? And racialized people who previously put up and shut up and put up, right, are no longer doing that. And they're speaking out, and they're speaking out about their experiences. They're speaking out about what's happened in organizations, and they need somewhere to take that. And if they're being coached, they expect that to be part of the conversation. And if you're not able to hold those conversations, then I kind of think you're failing as a coach. I don't really understand what you're coaching if you're not able to coach all of somebody. I just think it's a core competence. And I think, I haven't been around the coaching world that long, but I have seen more and more the coaching bodies are saying things about race and putting out papers and asking people to do work around race. And I think it's only a matter of time before people see this as a normal part of their CPD. I would expect that. I would hope that that's where we're going. I'm in so many different organizations now, from schools to businesses, working with lawyers, and we're all talking about race. Everybody is waking up to the idea, and all the regulatory bodies are waking up to this idea that this is a core competence. And, and the reason I'm in schools is because people are recognizing that young people, as the leaders of the future, need this as a core competence. So as coaches, what are we going to do? Are we going to join the rest of the country that are doing this work, or are we just going to be kind of clueless and sit in our privilege and tell ourselves how wonderful we are as coaches and just not be aware of a huge percentage of the population and their needs?
It's ironic, isn't it, that evoking awareness is a competency of coaching, and we have to have awareness ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have to notice when we don't know stuff and we're pushing up against it.
Yeah,
and we need to do something about it.
Sorry, I'm speaking over you. I do understand the fear. I do understand that people are scared of doing the wrong thing, scared of saying the wrong thing. But having held a number of courses and see people develop, it's not actually that hard, but you have to just be willing to show up. You have to be willing to show up, and to be willing to show up and not know very much. I think that's part of it, right? People are used to knowing quite a lot, right? Particularly as they get more senior in their coaching world. But actually, we're all beginners in this, and we all have to show up and learn and grow. And that's hard for people, but it's hard to experience racism. So I really hope that people wake up a little bit and stop putting it out there so much.
And the point of coaching is that we don't know.
Yeah, great.
But we need to confidently not know.
Yeah.
Rather than pretend we know because we're afraid of not knowing.
Yeah.
Well, Raggi, thank you so much. What a great conversation. I hope you'll come back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. So I'm Claire Pedrick, and I've been talking to Raggi Kotak, and Raggi's details are in the show notes. Thanks, Raggi.
Thanks very much. Bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.